Late July 1943. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat at his desk in northern Italy, reading intelligence summaries from Sicily. The Allied invasion of the island was in its third week, and German forces were being pushed back faster than expected. One American commander's name kept appearing in the reports: Major General Lucian Truscott, 3rd Infantry Division. Rommel underlined the name twice. Then he began writing an assessment his subordinate commanders would ignore for 9 months. By the time they remembered it, German forces would be fleeing Rome and the Italian campaign would be lost. The intelligence reports from Sicily were detailed. Truscott's 3rd Division had landed on July 10th and immediately began advancing at a tempo that German observers described as unprecedented for American forces. In the first week, they covered 30 miles. By week 2, they had advanced another 45 miles and were operating ahead of their supply lines. The data bothered Rommel, not because the Americans were advancing, everyone expected that, but because of the speed. German defensive planning assumed Allied forces would move at standard march rates, 2.5 miles per hour, consolidate positions every 6 to 8 hours, and establish secure supply lines before continuing. Truscott was not following that doctrine. His division was moving twice as fast as any other Allied unit in Sicily. Rommel had commanded in North Africa for 2 years. He knew American capabilities from Kasserine Pass, from the fighting in Tunisia, from dozens of engagements where he had tested their doctrine and found it wanting. But this general was different. Rommel pulled the operational summaries and studied Truscott's movements day by day. The pattern was clear: aggressive reconnaissance, rapid exploitation of weak points, forced marches that kept German units off balance, and most concerning, an apparent willingness to outrun his own logistics to maintain momentum. This was not the cautious American approach Rommel had observed in 1942 and early 1943. This was something German defensive planners had not accounted for. Rommel wrote a 3-page assessment and distributed it to his subordinate commanders in late July. The document was blunt. Truscott represented a more dangerous threat than his rank suggested. His operational tempo would collapse standard German defensive timetables. Any defensive line planned around normal Allied advance rates would be overrun before it could be properly manned. The assessment included specific recommendations: increase the depth of defensive positions, plan for fallback lines to be established 48 hours earlier than standard doctrine required. Do not assume American forces will pause to consolidate. Rommel signed it and sent it to 3 separate headquarters. None of them adjusted their defensive plans. They were focused on Bernard Montgomery and the British 8th Army advancing from the south. Montgomery was the known threat: methodical, cautious, predictable. Truscott was dismissed as a secondary concern. What Rommel's subordinates did not know was that he had discovered something in the intelligence data that would not be widely understood until May 1944. Truscott had implemented a forced march doctrine he called the Truscott Trot. Standard infantry marches covered 2.5 miles per hour with regular rest breaks. Truscott's units marched at 5 miles per hour. Double the standard pace, sustained for hours. His soldiers hated it. They called it everything from torture to insanity. But it worked. In Sicily, while other Allied divisions advanced and paused to let supplies catch up, Truscott's 3rd Division kept moving. German units attempting to establish defensive positions found Truscott's reconnaissance elements already probing their flanks before the positions were fully manned. The tempo did not just accelerate the campaign, it prevented German forces from executing their standard elastic defense doctrine. Rommel calculated what this meant for Italian operations. If Truscott commanded a corps-level formation and maintained his Sicily tempo, German defensive planning would fail. The Wehrmacht's doctrine in Italy relied on defensive lines that could be held for weeks while fallback positions were prepared. Kesselring's entire defensive strategy assumed Allied forces would advance methodically. allowing time to reinforce, retreat in good order, and establish the next line. But if an Allied commander could move at double the expected speed, those carefully timed withdrawals would turn into routs. Positions would be overrun before they could be reinforced. Supply dumps would be captured before they could be evacuated. Rommel wrote one sentence in his assessment that his commanders should have memorized. Against Truscott's operational tempo, traditional defensive depth becomes irrelevant because he reaches the second line before you finish manning the first. The assessment was filed away. German commanders in Italy had more pressing concerns. The Allied landings at Salerno in September 1943, the establishment of the Gustav Line across the Italian peninsula, planning for the expected spring offensive. Rommel himself was reassigned to France in November to prepare for the anticipated Allied invasion. His warnings about Truscott remained in filing cabinets at various headquarters. Unread. Forgotten. Meanwhile, Truscott was promoted. In January 1944, he took command of 6th Corps, 43,000 men. The assignment that would prove every word of Rommel's assessment correct. January 22, 1944. Operation Shingle. Allied forces landed at Anzio, a coastal town 30 miles south of Rome. Truscott's 6th Corps was part of the landing force, though he did not take command until mid-February. The German response was swift and effective. They contained the beachhead, established strong defensive positions, and settled into what became a 4-month stalemate. Inside German headquarters, confidence grew. The Anzio landing was supposed to unhinge the Gustav Line and force a rapid German withdrawal. Instead, Allied forces were pinned on the beach, unable to break out. German commanders congratulated themselves on their defensive prowess. The stalemate proved their defensive planning was sound. The Allies, they concluded, simply could not generate the offensive power to break through prepared German positions. Rommel's warning was not mentioned during this period. Why would it be? The situation at Anzio appeared to validate German defensive doctrine, not challenge it. Allied forces had landed in strength, secured a beachhead, and then stopped. This was exactly what German planners expected: methodical, cautious, predictable. What they did not know was that Truscott was using the stalemate to prepare. He trained his corps in the forced march doctrine. He drilled his division commanders on maintaining tempo during pursuit operations. He stockpiled supplies for a rapid breakout that would not pause to wait for logistics to catch up. And he studied the German defensive positions, looking for the exact moment when a high-tempo assault would do maximum damage. That moment came in May 23, 1944. Operation Diadem was planned as a coordinated offensive. British and Commonwealth forces would attack the Gustav Line from the south. Once German reserves were committed to that battle, Truscott's 6th Corps would break out from Anzio and drive toward Rome. The timing had to be precise. Break out too early, German reserves would crush the attack. Break out too late, German forces would have time to establish blocking positions. Truscott calculated he had a 72-hour window. He intended to use every minute of it. What he was about to do would validate Rommel's 9-month-old warning in the most devastating way possible. May 23, 1944. 0600 hours. 6th Corps erupted from the Anzio beachhead. German commanders expected a cautious advance. Standard Allied doctrine called for advancing, consolidating, securing flanks, bringing up reserves, then advancing again. A methodical approach that gave defenders time to identify the main axis of attack and shift forces accordingly. Truscott ignored all of that. His entire corps moved at forced march speed from the opening hour. Reconnaissance elements pushed ahead. Main force units followed without pausing. Artillery displaced forward continuously to maintain fire support. The German defensive line, designed to hold for 72 hours minimum, was penetrated in 8 hours. By noon on May 23rd, Truscott's lead elements had advanced 6 miles. German commanders were confused, but not yet alarmed. 6 miles was a respectable advance, but hardly catastrophic. They ordered their second defensive line to prepare to receive the American forces. Standard doctrine. The second line was positioned 12 miles from the beachhead. At normal Allied advance rates, Truscott would reach it in 3 days. That would give German forces adequate time to reinforce, establish fields of fire, and prepare a proper defense. But Truscott was not advancing at normal rates. By sunset on May 23rd, his vanguard had covered 14 miles. They had passed the second defensive line before German reinforcements arrived to man it. Inside German headquarters that evening, someone pulled out Rommel's assessment from the previous July. The document was 9 months old. It had been buried in files and largely forgotten. A staff officer began reading it aloud. The room went quiet. Rommel had written that Truscott's operational tempo would collapse standard defensive timetables. That defensive lines would be overrun before they could be properly manned. That fallback positions planned for 3 days in the future would need to be established within 48 hours. Every sentence described what was happening outside their bunker, word for word. The warning had been on their desks for 9 months. They were reading it for the first time as their defensive plan disintegrated. May 24th, day 2 of the breakout. Truscott's corps covered another 12 miles. German attempts to establish blocking positions failed because Truscott's reconnaissance elements identified and bypassed strong points, leaving them to be reduced by follow-on forces while the main advance continued. This was the forced march doctrine in action. Keep moving. Don't stop to reduce every obstacle. Bypass, exploit, maintain momentum. German commanders ordered a fighting withdrawal to positions 26 miles from Anzio. Those positions were supposed to be the stop line where the American advance would be contained. Truscott reached them on May 25th, 48 hours into the breakout. German forces were still moving into position when his lead units attacked. The collapse accelerated. By May 26th, 4 days after the breakout began, Truscott had advanced 40 miles from Anzio. The German 10th Army was in retreat. Defensive lines that were supposed to hold for weeks had fallen in hours. Supply dumps were being overrun before they could be evacuated. German units attempting to withdraw found American forces already astride their retreat routes. Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, ordered a general withdrawal toward Rome. The order acknowledged reality. The southern defensive line was collapsing under British pressure. The Anzio front was shattered. Rome could not be held. What nobody mentioned in the German staff conferences was that Rommel had predicted this exact scenario 9 months earlier. They had dismissed his warning as overcautious. They were paying for that mistake with the loss of the Italian capital. But Truscott was not finished. He had new orders. Get to Rome before the British 8th Army advancing from the south. It became a race. Montgomery's forces had fought through the Gustav Line and were pushing north. They had a shorter route to Rome. Truscott had farther to travel, but a higher operational tempo. The race would determine which Allied commander got credit for liberating the first Axis capital. More importantly, it would prove whether Truscott's forced march doctrine could sustain itself over extended operations. From May 30th to June 1st, Truscott's corps covered 62 miles in 48 hours. Some units marched for 16 hours straight. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. Vehicles broke down from sustained high-speed movement, and they kept advancing. June 4th, 1944. Truscott entered Rome. He had beaten Montgomery to the city despite having a longer route and less than 2 weeks to cover terrain that German planners assumed would take a month to traverse. The liberation of Rome made headlines worldwide. For German commanders in Italy, it represented catastrophic failure. Not just the loss of a city, but the validation of every warning Rommel had issued 9 months earlier. The defensive planning that had worked against Montgomery's methodical approach, that had contained the Anzio beachhead for 4 months, that had held the Gustav Line through the winter, had shattered against Truscott's operational tempo in less than 2 weeks. There were 40,000 German casualties. Thousands more were captured. Supply dumps, artillery pieces, and vehicles were abandoned during the retreat, all because they had planned their defenses around assumptions that Rommel had told them were wrong. The assessment Rommel wrote in July 1943 was circulated again after Rome fell. This time, commanders read it carefully. They studied Truscott's advance rates and compared them to Rommel's predictions. The correlation was exact. Truscott had moved at precisely the tempo Rommel warned about. The defensive lines had collapsed on the timeline Rommel calculated. The recommendations Rommel made, deeper defensive positions, earlier preparation of fallback lines, assuming no pause in enemy advances, would have helped. Not prevented the defeat, but made it less catastrophic. One German general wrote in his diary that Rommel had given them 9 months' warning. They used that time to prove him right instead of preparing for what he predicted. 2 weeks. That's all it took Rommel to understand Lucian Truscott after studying the Sicily reports. 2 weeks to recognize that this American general operated differently than his peers. 2 weeks to calculate what that operational tempo would mean for defensive planning in Italy. 2 weeks to write an assessment that accurately predicted the operational disaster that would unfold 9 months later. His subordinate commanders had those same 9 months. They had the intelligence data. They had Rommel's analysis. They had time to adjust their defensive doctrine, retrain their forces, prepare for a high-tempo enemy. They used that time to focus on Montgomery, to build defensive lines based on standard Allied advance rates, to assume that American cautiousness observed at Kasserine Pass would continue indefinitely. The warning had been precise and actionable. It sat in filing cabinets from August 1943 to May 1944, while German commanders planned defenses that Rommel had already told them would fail. They remembered the warning on May 23rd, when Truscott's breakout began moving faster than their defensive timeline could accommodate. They discussed it on May 24th, when positions fell before reinforcements arrived. They reread it on May 26th, when the withdrawal toward Rome became a rout. By June 4th, when Truscott entered Rome, the warning was being studied as a case example of intelligence ignored. Rommel had seen in 2 weeks what took his generals 9 months and a catastrophic defeat to understand. The American general who moved too fast wasn't an anomaly. He was the future of Allied operations in Europe, and they weren't prepared.